So I want to do a presentation on the possibility of a new approach to Christian apologetics. I'm talking about the debate between theists and atheists, and just ap- apologetics in general, not specific to a denomination or even necessarily to Christianity as a whole. So I'm not particularly satisfied with the way uh, the the field of apologetics is typically approached. Now, just to give some background from just of my own experience with the subject matter, sometime back in the early 2000s, I had just gotten married and moved to a new area where I didn't know anybody, and I ended up going back to school for a little bit, but I was working part time and going to school part time, so I would work as a teacher's helper or assistant or whatever for a few hours in the morning, so like maybe from 7 something till about 1 o'clock, and then twice a week I had classes in the evening. So that was pretty much my schedule, which meant there was quite a bit of free time. And then my wife, she had a job where she usually went to work later in the day and came home fairly late in the evening. So our schedules didn't match up very good that well, and because of that, I ended up having all this extra time, and I didn't know anybody in the area, so I didn't have other people to hang out with. So I started hanging out on just discussion forums online. Now, keep in mind, this is the early 2000s, so this is kind of something new. I mean, the internet was just getting started, websites were just getting started. Um, it had been around for a few years, but not much. I mean, probably the late 1990s when we started getting AOL and some of that stuff. And I had been working as a Bible worker before that, so I was traveling around a lot. I didn't have a lot of access to computers. So it was something new for me, and I had all this free time, so I'll be on the internet a lot. And I got caught up on different discussion forums where there was a lot of debates between theists and atheists. And first, I just started talking to people because I had nothing to do. And over time, I got so involved in it that I calculated that over the next several years, I ended up clocking in probably about 10,000 hours worth of debates, going back and forth with different atheists and people on the forums. Now, while doing this, um, what I came to realize is that I developed an approach of dealing with atheists that was very different than people, other Christians that were online and that were having conversations as well. And over time, I went back and I've done a lot more studying in theology and philosophy since that time. So I've come to understand why my approach is different and why people think the way they do. So I've kind of done a self-reflection, trying to understand my thinking, the thinking of other people, and I understand it now much better than I did back then. But my general approach to the matter hasn't really changed. So I want to spend a few minutes talking about how I approach it, the atheist debates, and why I want to people to consider the possibility that we can do things a bit differently. Now, this is going to be only an introductory video. I'm trying to keep it short because the subject matter is extremely complicated and it would take hours and hours to give a thorough presentation, but we'll see how it goes. Okay, so the typical theist arguments are, the cosmological argument, the fine-tuning argument, argument from design, the moral argument, ontological argument. The cosmological argument basically says whatever begins to exist has a cause, so there has to be some cause for why things exist. So the universe has a beginning, so that means something caused it to exist. Now, one of the reasons why atheists are not particularly convinced by this line of argumentation is that um, something definitely caused everything else to begin, but that something is not necessarily God. There might be other ways to think about it. So everybody's aware of this argument. It's not like atheists just haven't heard of them before. They're just ignorant or uneducated. Everybody's aware this argument exists. Some people find it compelling, some people don't. So the fine tuning is the argument that basically there's a certain precise set of factors that need to be in place for the universe to exist the way it is. It's somewhat of a statistical argument, and there's kind of ways around it. It's a semi okay argument, but it's not as strong as I think. I don't think it's as strong as people make it out to be. The argument from design was a lot stronger back in the day, but now with the theory of evolution, some aspects of these arguments have weakened. The moral argument is basically just saying that there is such a thing as right and wrong in the world, and unless there's somebody to tell us what is right and what is wrong, that we wouldn't have a sense of right and wrong. So that means there has to be somebody out there that created the concept of morality. Um, this argument can you can get around this argument by just saying that look, right and wrong are intrinsic to the way things are. So like, you have two people that live together in the same community or same place, and in order to survive they need to get along, so they need to create different rules for coexisting and things like that, and there becomes you end up with some kind of sense of right and wrong. So there's different ways to argue these, both in the positive and the negative. The ontological argument is an argument I've never really had any interest in. It's a really strange argument, and every time I explain why I don't see any value in it, people say you don't understand it, and then I ask them, okay, send me something that I can read to understand it, and I read it, and it doesn't make any more sense to me. It's basically this idea that a concept such as God can exist in some possible world, um, and the way it's formulated is as a I can't think of the expression now. It's some kind of philosophical expression where it's a maximal being. So a maximal being can exist in some possible world, but if it exists in one possible world, it would have to exist in all possible worlds, because it would have been maximal unless it was in all possible worlds. So that means it needs to exist in our world, which is a very strange way to argue for God. So I never really paid any attention to that. I've never read or seen or heard anything that made a compelling case for that argument, even though other people swear by it. It is what it is. So those are the typical arguments people make. Now, on the atheist side, the way that atheist thing is sort of like this. It's like when somebody makes a claim for something, they have a burden of proof to support that claim. So if I say something like eating bananas is bad for you, most people wouldn't just stop eating bananas because I said it. I mean, I could just be some random person who doesn't know what he's talking about. I would need to provide some evidence. Now, the more extraordinary a claim is, the more extraordinary the evidence itself needs to be. So if I claim something that, some great thing is going to happen, like let's say I claim that I'm strong enough to lift 10,000 pounds over my head, then I need to provide a demonstration, because it's something that's extremely hard to believe. So I need to provide evidence for my claim. The only type of legitimate evidence is scientific evidence. So when you talk to atheists, what you find is that they put a lot more weight on scientific evidence than any other kind of evidence. So this is one reason why they don't care as much about rational evidences as the ones that the theists provide, like the cosmological argument, the fine-tuning, or the ontological argument, for example. They're not so much interested in philosophical or rational arguments. They're interested in scientific evidence. That's the thing that they find compelling. But of course, there is no way to scientifically prove that God exists. So because of that, it's just, atheists will say, well, I have no reason to take that possibility seriously. So this is generally the approach atheists take to the topic, and then theists come from the other approach. Now, in just my personal interaction, and I could be wrong because I don't have a way to test this, and it's not something that is, it is not an idea that can be tested well in a lab, so to speak, like where you could put together an experiment and really verify whether this is true or not. This is just my impression from interacting with people over the years. But whenever you have a debate between theists and atheists, you usually have four groups. So you have people that are decided theists. So basically, this group right here, the decided theists, it doesn't matter what evidence the atheist provides, it doesn't matter what arguments, it doesn't matter how weak the theist makes the case, they're always going to side with theism because they're basically their mind is set and they're not going to change their mind no matter what. So there's a group that is basically stuck in theism, and in the same way there's a group that's stuck in atheism. They've made up their mind, and the arguments don't actually matter. It's just a decision they made at some point, whether they realize it or not, and they're basically committed to that position, and you're not going to change their mind. Besides these two extremes, and there are usually a lot more people on the theism side because the country still has a background in you know, it's a nation that's fairly religious. So if we were going to go to some public debate and you looked at the audience in the auditorium, probably the majority of people would be in the decided theist camp. There'll be some people in the decided atheist camp. But then there's some people who are undecided, but they lean towards theism because they grew up in the church. Maybe they have some background in theism. And the reason they're undecided is not because they don't want to be theists, it's because they've come to some kind of crisis of faith. And a lot of times it's because maybe they've read some arguments made by atheists. Maybe they've come across a set of questions that they couldn't answer. So they might even identify as atheists, but what they're there for is just looking for some reasonable um, evidence that will give them sufficient reason to go back to theism. So these guys, as long as the theist makes a reasonably good case, they're going to side with the theist as well, even though they came into the debate relatively undecided. But to me, these people are not true undecided. They're not truly neutral because they're only there hoping to find evidence to support what they already are leaning towards. But you do have a neutral group, a group that is truly undecided, so they could go either way based on the evidence. And in my experience, watching these different groups of people interact in debate situation, my experience, people that are truly neutral over time tend to side with the atheists, which tells me that the arguments or the approach that a lot of theists bring to the table hasn't been the greatest. And it seems to me that we're actually losing the people who are who are truly on the fence, the people um, that are open to both possibilities, because over the long term, atheists seem to make a more reasonable case, and as long as somebody isn't biased one way or the other, they seem to win people over to their side. But the problem with that is that it's hard to recognize this because there's this large group of people, either people that are already committed theists or people that are uncommitted theists. But these guys could go to a debate and then come on the side of the theist, and the theist feels like they're winning, even though the only people that really matter are the neutral ones. And it seems like we're kind of losing this group by the approach we have to apologetics. So because of that, I mean, that's one reason, but that's one reason why I've spent time thinking about a new way to approach apologetics. But it's also because I personally never really found the theist arguments that compelling. I mean, yeah, there's some value to them, but it's not like I would have it would have changed my mind if I was really on the fence on the issue. So those are reasons why I've kind of taken a different approach. But okay, so in my experience, when you look at theist and atheist debates, it seems like people are just really talking past each other. In other words, they're not really connecting in their arguments. The arguments are very different. They have different approaches, different rational um, frameworks, and the different groups seem to kind of just not really make any progress in the conversation. So a lot of times atheists will look at theists and say, hey, they're unreasonable, they're not looking for facts, they're just wanting to live in their imaginary fantasy land, they're biased, and so on. While theists will look at the atheists and say, um, they might have had an excuse before they had a chance to understand the arguments, but now that they understand the arguments, the only other reason why they are rejecting the evidence is because they like the fact that God doesn't exist. They like to not have somebody to somebody to be responsible to. They want to live their life and live in their sin and things like that. And TS will talk about how the Holy Spirit reaches out to every single human being that is in the world. And because of that, for somebody to be an atheist, that means their conscience is already seared with a hot iron. And even though they talk as if they're neutral, or they're open to evidence, and even though they talk as if they're being reasonable, in fact, they've already committed unpardonable sin, and that's why they are where they're at. Or at least they've rejected the truth, and that's why they're where they're at, and they're just lying to everybody else, and confusing people. So these are the types of rationales that many use to explain why the other side isn't as impressed by the arguments as they are. So each side thinks that their arguments are solid, and then they blame the other side for not taking those arguments seriously. So there's this sort of wedge between the two groups. And it's very hard to communicate like this, because both sides think if a person was really honest and really well educated and really examined the evidence properly, they would conclude either this side or that side. Each side thinks their side is what a truly intelligent, well-educated, unbiased person would arrive at if they really took the time to consider the position seriously. And it is a unfortunate way to work or to have this conversation, because it sort of creates barriers when both sides question the sincerity and the integrity of the other side in the discussion. So what I've tried to propose is an alternative approach to it, and to say, no, it doesn't have to be one or the other. There is such a thing as a neutral position from which these conversations can take place. And it's possible for both sides to actually be rational in their point of view. So most people think about the question of the existence of God kind of like an on-off button. So, either the switch is on, God exists, and if for whatever reason there's sufficient evidence one way or the other, you might turn the switch to the other side, and that means God doesn't exist. But rather, instead of thinking it as this sort of two-way possibility, like this dichotomy, we can think of the question of the existence of God as a graduation of possibilities, or what's the word here? We could think of it as a scale. And in fact, there is such a thing as a neutral position, where we say it's not possible to know either way. It's not possible to know whether God exists or God doesn't exist. Just judging on rational or scientific arguments alone. So there is the possibility of a neutral position. And by working from this neutral position, you can allow space for both sides to be rational. So a theist and an atheist could look at each other and say, hey, I fully understand your perspective, and I think you're rational in the decision you're making, the way you're looking at the world. And I think my side is rational in the way we approach the question at the same time. So then how is that possible? How is it possible for two opposing points of view to be rational at the same time? And the answer is by acknowledging the limitations we have as human beings. So this is an illustration I always use when I try to help people make sense of their own limitations on this topic. So I say, okay, imagine that you went out somewhere to get a bite to eat or something. You were all by yourself. You ate something and then you fall asleep. And the next thing you remember, you don't remember anything except the next day you wake up, or sometime later you wake up in this room. And there's this huge room that has no windows and no doors, and the walls are really thick, and there's no way for you to break through it or see what's outside, or what's going on. So the question is, when you're in this situation, what is your access to knowledge? What can you find out about where you are? So really, human beings have two avenues to knowledge. One of them is our senses, and one of them is our reasoning. So if you're in this room, you could maybe go around and knock on the walls. You could scream and see, put your ear to the wall and see if you hear anything from the outside. You could try to find a hole somewhere, climb around and see if there's any crack anywhere that you could look through. Pretty much anything to do with your senses, smell, touch, hear, see, all these things you could feel around, but if all that doesn't give you any information, like there's no crack in the wall, you don't hear anything, you have no access to anything, then basically that is the end of your sensory access to knowledge. You have no idea where you are, you have no idea what's going on, you have no information about where this room is. Are you still in your hometown, or were you taken somewhere else? You don't know. The senses are basically limited by these walls, and you cannot go beyond them. You cannot use your senses to go through this through the walls around you to figure out what's going on. But that's not the end of your ability here, what you can do. You also have your reason, and your reason, what you can do with your reason is speculate about possibilities. So you might say, okay, what are some plausible reasons as to why I'm in this room? How did I get here? Is somebody keeping me here for ransom? Am I being kidnapped because they're trying to get some money out of me? What's another possibility? Maybe this is some kind of science experiment. Maybe somebody wants to see how a person will react when they're locked up in a room like this for an extended period of time. Or maybe this is some kind of reality television show where I'm being watched to see what's happening. Or maybe some friends are playing a trick on me, or something to that effect. So basically, you could use your reason to think about possible scenarios. Now, you might say, speculation is worthless because you don't know which option is correct. But it's not exactly worthless, because by thinking about possible situations, you're eliminating other situations that aren't really likely. So you're reducing the amount of possibilities you have to work with. And then maybe over time, as you gather additional evidence, you might say, okay, out of all these different hypotheses that I had in my mind, some seem more plausible now than some of the others. So the number of possibility can be reduced over time. But nonetheless, we got to acknowledge that this speculation. So whenever we use our reason to think about this stuff, the speculation is just that. It's a educated guess, but it could be just as likely as some other guess. So we don't have a way to know for sure. And beyond that, really, there's not much more we can do in and of ourselves when we're stuck inside this room. Now, in a situation where maybe somebody else is there as well, because they put us in the room and they're sitting outside and they're maybe watching us, they might be able to communicate with us and give us additional information. But if they choose to be silent, then we're stuck and we're limited to what we can do. So what does that mean? Well, we live in this universe where we're on this planet and we're hurtling through space at millions of miles or whatever the speed of the planet is. But anyway, we're basically just stuck in the situation, and we know very little about why we're here, how we got here, any of this stuff. We're limited, and all we can really observe with our senses is the physical material world. But just because that's the only thing we can observe doesn't mean that's the only thing that exists or that can exist. So essentially, we can have two possibilities. This world, this material world, is all there is, or maybe there's something else beyond it that we just can't observe because we don't have the sensory mechanisms to observe it. We can speculate, okay, is there something out there beyond this material reality, or not? And if there is something out there, is it some kind of intelligent entity which actually understands what they're doing and they put us here on purpose? Or is it some kind of just a force or something else? All these are speculations that we can make, but there's no way for us to know for sure. So by starting from this realization of our epistemic limitations, the limitations of our ability to have access to knowledge about our situation, we create space for uh, multiple positions, multiple possibilities to be reasonable at the same time. So again, possibilities, some of the possibilities are there is a God or there isn't a God. We're limited because we cannot see beyond our immediate environment. If, however, there is such a thing as an intelligent entity that's outside of this material reality we are in, then there's the possibility of additional access to knowledge, because there could be such thing as revelation. So this entity, and we're calling it God, but whatever entity exists outside of reality, this entity can make themselves known if they are, if in fact they do exist. So we have different hypotheses, different possibilities. If there isn't anything outside of our material reality, it's kind of hard for us to ever know that for sure because we're still limited by our senses. But if something is out there, they can try to communicate with us. But the value of approaching things from this angle is that it it takes away this sort of adversarial relationship between theist and atheist, where each side questions the sincerity or the intelligence or the level of education of the other side. Each side is convinced that their point of view is the only rational position. So the two sides are constantly basically just talking past each other, and they cannot imagine how the other side could could be, could be holding a legitimate position. So essentially, hey, this is my point of view is the only rational way to think about this. So you have to be wrong. But if we step back and we say no, there are certain limitations to a human being's ability to know what reality is all about, and the possibility is both possibilities are there. It's possible that you could be right and reality is the way you imagine it. It's possible that I could be right and the reality is the way I could imagine it. And by giving this sort of um, space for both sides to be rational, then we can relax and say, okay, so what now? Well, now let's explore each point of view. So we can sit down and listen to this person's perspective and say, okay, that makes sense. I understand where you're coming from. And then somebody else could bring their point of view, and they have their own hypothesis about how reality is like, and we can sit and evaluate that position without any sense of discomfort because it's being pressed on us as the only rational option. And then they could listen to our position as well. So by taking a neutral approach to apologetics, I think we can actually create an environment that is more conducive to even having people consider our point of view more thoughtfully than they would if they were in this adversarial um, position where they just basically thought, no, it's either our way or everything else doesn't make sense. So I know this is very limited in terms of, as far as a new approach to apologetics is concerned. I haven't said a whole lot to explain all the details, but I just thought I'll put this sort of introduction out there. I keep thinking that one day I'll sit down and write a book about this, but I never seem to find the time. So um, I thought maybe other people would be interested in thinking about apologetics from this angle, and we can explore the possibility further.